Alright, today we're going to talk about all the different causes for wildfire. You've probably heard of some of the main things people talk about, like temperature, winds, fuel, topography, but throughout this video we're going to break down all the different factors because it's a lot more nuanced than you may think, and it turns out it's really not just one factor, it's really the interconnectedness and how all of these factors combine with each other. So the main thing that you need to understand is the fire behavior triangle. It's fuel, weather, topography. And these are the three factors that lead to your fire behavior. So within weather, we'll dive into that one first. You have temperature, wind, and humidity. So temperature, that one's pretty easy to understand. The hotter it is, the worse your wildfires are going to be. And that's usually directly tied to the fact that when it's hotter out, it's also going to be drier out. So it's very connected with our second weather factor, which is relative humidity. And the drier it is out there, the worse your fires are going to be. And as a wildfire forecaster, I am usually pretty afraid once I see relative humidities in the single digits. That's when things get a bit more dangerous out there, because when the air is dry, the fuels get dry, and then it's a lot easier for fires to start, and then they spread a lot faster once they do. Now, one thing that's kind of a nuance, even within relative humidity, that's also important is not just about how dry it is during the day, it's also about how well you recover overnight. So another thing that I always keep an eye on as a wildfire forecaster is you never want to see single-digit relative humidities during the daytime at the peak of the afternoon. That's usually when wildfires are at their worst. But what you do want to see is overnight for maybe some clouds to move in, some moisture to go up as the temperatures cool down. And then that brings a little bit more moisture back into your fuels during the overnight hours, so then it calms the fire down. And then you start off the next day in just a little bit better of a position. So when you have poor recoveries overnight, the fuels just stay dry all night long. The fire could even continue overnight, strong overnight behavior, and then that leads to more extreme behavior overall. And then the last one that I haven't mentioned yet is wind, and I would say this is one of the most important factors overall for some of the big fires that we see. In Southern California, you've probably heard of the Santa Ana winds. And then in Northern California, we have downslope winds or Diablo winds. In Santa Barbara, they call them sundowner winds. But it's oftentimes downslope winds that are the worst because it takes air from kind of higher up, and then as it moves downward, it compresses and warms up and dries out. And then on top of that, it's also windy. So then it's a combination of all of the factors that lead to kind of bad wildfire conditions. But within the winds, that might get a little too into the science there, talking about downslope. So let's just break down the easiest part of wind to understand. First off is speed. Second off is direction. So with speed, that's pretty intuitive. The faster the winds are going, the faster the fire is going to be moving. And that's for a few reasons. One, it just pushes the fire forward. The second thing is it provides more oxygen to the fire. And then the third aspect of stronger winds leading to faster growth is it can pick up little burning embers, toss them out ahead of the major blaze, and start new little spot fires. And then those can grow and then connect with the major blaze. And that's often the one that I keep an eye on as a forecaster as well, because I believe it was the Dixie fire. They had just a great containment line over the entire northern edge of the fire. And then there was one windy afternoon, it picked up an ember, dropped it over the containment line, and then the fire took off 15 miles in one day. So it was all this great work that the firefighters had been putting in for 3 or 4 days to build this containment line was just ruined because of a few embers that were picked up and tossed over it. So wind, another very important factor, and direction is also important as well. I would say the main thing that I look for with direction is if it's coming from offshore or onshore. If it's onshore winds, that means it's coming from, if you're talking about the California coast, that means it's coming from the ocean and then moving air onto land. And that's actually the kind of wind that you would want, because as you'd imagine, the air over the ocean has a lot more moisture in it. So onshore winds would actually be a good thing because it brings some of that moisture in, which goes into your fuels, calms down fire behavior. It's the offshore wind events that you have to watch out for in terms of wind direction, and that's because it's bringing in usually warmer, drier air instead of the moisture from the coast. So that's our weather factor. Next, let's look at topography, and this one should be, I'd say, a lot quicker. Won't go into all the different weeds here, but the main thing that you have to understand is that fires like to go uphill. So, and the steeper the topography, the faster it's going to go uphill. The reason for that is, there's two reasons for it. Something called flame tilting, and then also preheating. And it's kind of connected with each other. So if you imagine, and just the fact that heat rises. So think about all of those things and think about a hillside right here. Or actually, let's go flatland first. And you have your fire right here in the middle, and maybe 2 trees on the side. All of your heat from that fire, or most of it, is going to go straight up, and your trees are going to keep some of the moisture that they have in them. And then by the time the fire gets there, it's still going to have to suck out a lot of that moisture out of the tree before it can catch it on fire. So it slows growth in that aspect. Now let's take our land and put it at a tilt. So now our flames down here and our trees up here, some of the heat from that flame is heating up the tree before the flames even get there. So it's evaporating out some of the moisture, and then by the time the flames get there, the tree is just ready to burst into flames. So it's able to go a lot faster. And then the other aspect here is what's called flame tilting. If the flames are tilted over like this, it's also just able to heat up some of those fuels just below it, and that leads to faster growth as well. And then also with topography, there's things like canyons that can lead to faster growth, or it can just impact your winds. There's all types of aspects there. I'm not going to get into those just yet. I think the main one is to understand that fires go faster uphill. And then actually one other thing I should say is they can also move, so fires move slower downhill, but one thing you should look out for is when you get rolling debris, that can sometimes take fire that was uphill, it rolls down the hill, and then it starts a fire down there. And that's why some firefighters, I forget what it's called, it's some kind of trench that they dig, and it's meant to actually catch any rolling debris that might be going down the hill. So last one that we're going to talk about here is fuel. And in my opinion, this is probably the most important factor, because if there's no fuel, there's no fire. If there's an abundance of fuel and it's dried out, that's going to be pretty important. So just right there, you can see how it's also connected. If your fuel has a ton of moisture in it, it's probably not going to be a huge problem. But being in California, we have a Mediterranean climate, which means we dry out during the summer. So our fuels almost always end up being pretty dry, even though for this year, 2023, we're actually in a pretty good position because of all of the rain and snow that we picked up this last winter. So with fuel, I already sort of mentioned one, but huge part of fuel is how much fuel that you have. So fuel accumulation. And this is one of the criticisms of fire suppression, is if you don't allow fires to happen, the fires that in a natural California ecosystem would burn out the fuel, then all that fuel is able to accumulate, and then it actually just leads to worse fires in the future. And then also with fuel and that fuel accumulation, if you think about the fact that maybe in a natural California ecosystem, an acre of land would sustain, I'm just going to throw out a random number, 20 trees. But then if you don't allow fire to maybe kill some of the new trees that are trying to pop up, like what happened for thousands of years in California before we came here, it allows more trees to be on the land than should be sustained by that land. So instead of 20 trees, you have 100 trees. And then there's not an increase in water, so now you have 100 trees sharing the same amount of water as maybe 20 trees. So then they're all weaker, and then they're more susceptible to disease or pests like bark beetles. And then they die, and then that just fuels even more extreme wildfire because you have all these dead trees sitting up in the mountains. And I'm trying to remember the fact I read the other day, but I believe I read that the Sierra has over 100 million dead trees because of exactly what I just explained, a combination of drought and just too many trees, not enough water. So there's fuel accumulation. There's also kind of the continuity of the fuels. So what you don't want to have is grass, then brush, then trees, because that can lead to what's called a crown fire, where it starts in the grass and then it goes into the brush and then it goes up into the tree and the entire forest gets destroyed. What you do want to have is your forest up in the mountains and then allow surface fires to happen maybe every decade, every 20 years, and that clears out a lot of the lower fuels, so it's a lower intensity fire. And then the trees don't burn down, and it actually just keeps things a lot healthier. It's a different story for the chaparral. I've talked about that in a previous video. So fuel, we talked about fuel density, fuel accumulation, fuel continuity, but then I would say the biggest one is fuel moisture. And this is actually what my master's thesis showed. I had rank ordered using machine learning all the different factors of wildfire, and the most important factor that came up on my list was fuel moisture, because the drier the fuels are, the easier it is for a fire to start, and then the faster that fire is going to spread. So with all that being said, I think since I threw a lot of information at you, it could be a good time just for a summary. There are lots of different factors that lead to wildfire in California. It all ties down to the fire behavior triangle, which is fuel, weather, and topography. Within weather, we have winds, temperature, and humidity. Within topography, main thing you need to know is that fires travel faster uphill. And then with fuels, it matters how many fuels have accumulated, how continuous those fuels are, and most importantly, how dry those fuels are. So hopefully you learned something throughout the course of this video. I'll be talking about wildfire throughout this entire fire season. Hopefully it's a nice calm one for us, and I'd say there's a good chance it is based on how much rain and snow we picked up this last year. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching.